The night she asked that question was already breaking me. Rain hammered the windows like it was trying to get inside, and my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in months, a name I thought I'd finally learned how to live without. "Is there space left in your bed?" she wrote. Not a hello. Not an apology. Just those 7 words that dragged me straight back to every promise we never kept and every goodbye that never felt real. I stared at the ceiling, my heart loud enough to drown out the storm, knowing that whatever I answered would change the rest of my life. I typed, erased, typed again, then finally sent the truth I'd been hiding from myself. "For you? There is always space." I didn't know then that she wasn't asking about a bed. She was asking if there was still space in my life, in my heart, in the man I'd become after she left. She arrived an hour later, soaked, shivering, standing under the flickering hallway light like someone who'd walked 1,000 miles to reach one last door. We stood there in silence, 2 people carrying different versions of the same pain. She looked smaller somehow, like the world had taken pieces of her while she was gone. When I pulled her into a hug, she didn't cry right away. She just stood there, breathing, as if she needed to make sure I was real. Inside, the apartment felt too quiet, filled with the ghosts of who we used to be. I made tea we barely drank. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, pretending the space between us didn't matter. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. She told me she'd been strong for too long, that every night felt heavier than the last, that she was tired of pretending she didn't miss the place where she once felt safe. I wanted to tell her I'd waited, that every empty night had taught me something about patience and pain, but instead I listened, because sometimes love isn't about speaking, it's about staying. When we finally lay down, fully clothed, backs turned at first, the question hovered in the dark like a fragile thing. Was this comfort or was it a mistake? I felt her shift closer, not touching, just enough to feel warmth. In that quiet, I realized the bed wasn't what mattered. It was the choice to let someone see you when you're still healing. By morning, nothing was solved, but something had changed. The storm outside had passed, and so had some of the fear inside me. I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of the hardest chapter, the one where you decide whether love deserves another chance, even when it scares you. I didn't sleep much after that night, because the morning brought a different kind of question, one I couldn't ignore anymore. When sunlight crept through the curtains, she was awake, staring at the wall, her voice barely above a whisper when she said, "I don't want to hurt you again." Those words hit harder than any goodbye. This was the hook that pulled me deeper, because I finally understood the real risk. Loving her again meant opening myself to the same pain that once nearly broke me. We spent the day talking, really talking, about everything we'd avoided before. The misunderstandings, the pride, the moments we chose silence instead of honesty. She admitted she'd left because she was afraid of becoming invisible in her own life. I admitted I'd stayed quiet because I was scared of pushing too hard and losing her. We weren't villains, just 2 flawed people who didn't know how to fight for each other properly. Days turned into weeks. She didn't move back in, not right away. We rebuilt slowly, like learning how to walk on a healed but still tender leg. There were setbacks. Old habits crept in. Doubt knocked at the door more than once. But this time, we answered together. One night, after a long day, she looked at me and smiled, not the desperate smile from the rain-soaked hallway, but a calm, certain one. "Is there still space?" she asked softly. I took her hand and felt how steady it was. "There always will be," I said, understanding now that space isn't about proximity. It's about willingness. The night she finally stayed again, the bed felt different. Not because of passion, but because of peace. We lay there talking about dreams instead of regrets, about the future instead of the past. I realized that love doesn't mean never breaking, it means choosing to rebuild when you do. As she fell asleep, her breathing slow and even, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope without fear. The inspiring truth I carried into that night was simple but powerful. There is always space for love when you choose honesty, patience, and growth. Not just in a bed, but in a heart that's learned to forgive and believe again. If this story touched you, remember this: sometimes the bravest thing you can do is make space, not because it's easy, but because it's worth it. The second night didn't begin with a message or a knock. It began with silence, the kind that presses against your chest and forces you to think. I was lying there alone, staring at the same ceiling, wondering if hope was just another way of hurting yourself politely. Then my phone buzzed. One line. "Can I come over?" No drama, no poetry, just honesty. That was the hook that pulled me back in, because this time she wasn't running from the storm, she was choosing to walk through it. When she arrived, she didn't look lost anymore. She looked determined, like someone who had finally decided to stop surviving and start living. She sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched, and for the first time, neither of us moved away. She told me everything she'd never said out loud before. How lonely strength can be when no one sees it. How leaving felt powerful at first, then slowly turned into regret. How every place she slept felt empty because safety isn't walls or blankets, it's a person who knows your silence. I told her how the nights after she left taught me discipline, not peace. How I learned to cook for one, sleep in the middle of the bed, and pretend that missing her was a phase instead of a constant. There were moments when our voices cracked, moments when we laughed at memories that once hurt too much to remember. Each word felt like stitching something torn, carefully, slowly, afraid to pull too hard. This time, when we lay down, there was no hesitation. She rested her head on my chest, and I felt the weight of trust settle there. Not heavy, just real. The world outside kept moving, but inside that room, time softened. We didn't promise forever. We promised honesty. We promised to speak even when our voices shook. Somewhere between her breathing evening out and my heartbeat slowing, I understood the lesson I'd been avoiding. Space isn't something you give once. You choose it again and again. You make room for mistakes, for growth, for the person someone is becoming, not just who they were. Morning came gently. No panic, no rush. She smiled at me, the kind of smile that says, "I'm still here," and in that moment, I knew this wasn't about reclaiming the past. It was about building something stronger than it ever was. When she finally asked, "Do you think this can last?" I didn't answer quickly. I looked at her, really looked, and said, "If we keep choosing each other, yes." And that was the truth that stayed with me. Love doesn't survive because there's always space in a bed. It survives because there's space in the heart for patience, courage, and change. That night taught me that making space is an act of faith, and sometimes, faith is all you need to begin again.